closer. I will call to order an adjourned regular meeting of the City Council. This is July 1, 2008. Roll call, please.
Councilman Ziprick.
Present.
Councilman Peterson.
Present.
Councilman Rigsby.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tempore Browers absent. Mayor Chrisman.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Mr. Holloway, any items to be added or deleted?
None, Mayor.
And I don't believe there's a conflict of interest on this item, so we will go to item E on the agenda, and I need to turn my cell phone off. And City Clerk, please.
Mr. Mayor, were you going to take any public comments?
I didn't see that, and you're right. We should take public comment. I missed that. Public comment by Jim Walling, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. I'd like to take just a brief moment to express on behalf of the Lopers Club our appreciation to Mayor Chrisman, who soon will be going off the council, for all of his years of effort in acquiring the land and the trails, his contribution to the city acquiring the land and the trails known as the South Hills Preserve. We have followed that very carefully, and probably that's one of the main reasons I've been on the Trails Development Committee. It's culminated in the purchase of the most recent at least, roughly 600 acres. So we now, thanks to you and other members of the council, years of hard work, have the opportunity to preserve this for years to come. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to confer upon you the title of honorary lifetime member of the Lopers Club. And with that,
wear a pink t-shirt.
Yes.
Oh boy. You think that'll fit, Mark?
it may not fit, but we assume that since you won't be going to so many free breakfasts, lunch, and mixers and dinners, that it soon will. Hold it up. And since I wear two hats this evening, I'll take another minute and a half. And on behalf of the Trails Development Committee of the City of Loma Linda, which I've chaired for the last several years, had the opportunity to work very closely with Councilman Ziprick. He's been our liaison, and most of you members of the council. And particularly we recognize he doesn't like to be called that, but the father of the hills, Bob Chrisman, was responsible for the original purchase. Otherwise, we probably would not be here talking about this evening and thanking him for it. The Trails Development Committee of the City of Loma Linda hereby express their appreciation and gratitude to Mayor Robert Chrisman for his untiring efforts and vision in acquiring and preserving the South Hills Preserve and Trail System for the City of Loma Linda. The Trails Development Committee, July 1, 2008. My honor and my pleasure to present this to you with our thanks.
Well, thank you.
Just a side comment, I hope this now puts to rest all the rumors that Mayor Chrisman is going to run a road through the South Hills or put 1,200 houses in the South Hills. To us that worked with him on the committee, that was absurd. We knew that he'd worked hard for maybe 13, 15 years at least, acquiring those hills. There is no way that he was interested in putting that up there. However, I hope this now finally and forever puts that false rumor to rest. And again, our thanks and our appreciation.
Thank you. And thank you for your kind words. I think people knew that wasn't true, but it did get some people's attention. Okay, we'll go to item F on the agenda, which is the special municipal election. City Clerk, please.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, there are 3 actions tonight on the agenda. One is to call and give notice of the November 4 election, to submit to the voters the council-sponsored open space protection measure. There is a new version that is at your desk. Had minor modifications from the one that was originally in your agenda packet. And the city attorney can probably go over those changes with you. The measure will include a map that outlines all of the land included in this measure. The second action is to adopt a resolution that will provide for the filing of rebuttal arguments. And the third one is setting the priorities for filing written arguments. City Council does have priority on arguments. If the resolutions are adopted this evening, then the authors of the primary arguments would need to have those in by Tuesday, July 15. It's 14 days after the action. And then any rebuttal arguments, if there are any, would be the date would be 10 days later, July 25. The word count is there in my report. And that concludes my report.
Mr. Holloway, anything to add?
I'd be happy to answer any questions. The final draft of the open space protection measure that is before you includes, well, I should back up. I started out with the intent to keep it as simple as possible, and as I went through several versions, it became shorter and shorter and simpler and simpler. The last version, however, does go back and add 2 paragraphs. If you look on page 1 under section 1, purpose and intent, the second and fifth whereas paragraphs have been added, and the intent of those paragraphs is just to make clear that the City Council does not intend by this new measure to revoke or supersede or amend the previous hillside initiative or Measure V in any way regarding other property that is still out there in the hills owned by parties other than the city or elsewhere in the city or in the city's sphere of influence. In other words, this measure simply says that the open space that the land that the city has acquired in those hills will be permanent open space unless the voters in the future vote to change that. And if that were to happen, Measure B and the general plan and the original hillside initiative would still be in effect as to anything that might happen out there in the future if the voters chose to take the land out of public open space. But that obviously can't happen without the voters' approval at any time in the future. The last minor change was we did delete reference to the targeted open space with regards to any possible density bonuses or transfers being prohibited. And the reason we did that is that although the targeted open space concept is on a map that's been commonly used here at the City Council and in the community, there was a concern that that maybe was not officially part of the general plan yet, although I believe it was intended to be part of the updated general plan that's being processed. So we deleted that reference, but it's still clear that no density transfers or bonuses would be permitted to be used as to the city-owned open space land. And with that, I again be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Lloyd?
Yeah, question. Who owns the mineral rights under that land, number one? And number two, does this measure preclude the drilling for oil in view of the great crisis we have in America at the moment?
Well,
Leave it to Floyd to ask that kind of question.
the title report for the land that we're purchasing, the most recent purchase, does indicate that there are some oil and gas rights that are owned by somebody else.
Oh, is that right?
Maybe Mr. Ziprick could answer that.
Well, I was going to just comment briefly. Geology's been a hobby, and I've studied the oil industry for quite a few years, and the closest oil field that I'm aware of to here is in the area of Corona. So, geologically speaking, this has not been an area of vast oil reserves. So, if we should be so lucky as to find oil in our town, that would be very interesting, but I have a feeling we're not going to find that. I don't think geology is right. We're in a different province than where the oil fields are found, mostly in L.A.
Okay. Any other questions?
Back to the mineral rights, though. Actually, who owns them? How far down do we own?
I don't know who currently owns the oil and gas rights. There may have been transfers, but Mr. Ellsman might know that, but I don't see him here tonight.
But this has not been a highly mineralized area either. What you have here, according to geology books, is you have a lake bed formation known as the San Mateo Formation, which is basically sand. It goes down several thousand feet. So what you see is what you get. Basically, a very soft type of earth. That's why it's great for mountain biking. It has some great purposes, and that's one of them, and hiking and things like that. But it's not a igneous area, which usually is where you find lode mines, and it's not sedimentary of the type that produces oil fields. So, anyway.
I'm presuming we can't be held responsible for damage from earthquakes occurring on that property, which we just had the other day, a couple of them, I think.
Earthquakes I think, are a little beyond the control of any owner. For example, the earthquake that occurred the other day was, I believe, I checked on Google Earth, it was the northeast corner of California and Park, under a house. And
6.5 miles down.
yes, but nevertheless, I don't think that property owner would be responsible for it.
Any other questions? Any comments from the public on this issue? Welcome.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, fellow council members. My name is David Warner. I live here in Loma Linda. The concern I have is whether this is a matter that should in fact be submitted to the citizens for a vote. I've heard that the council would like to have the property deemed as open space. The question I have is whether that is the only good use for the property. If there are other good uses, such as was pointed out here, perhaps there would be mineral rights that could be exploited. Also, I'm not certain how large the area is and whether it could be developed. As a member of the Planning Commission, I am familiar with the reports that the experts have provided, the paid experts have provided, and said the city has to provide certain level of housing over the coming years, not only low-cost housing, but high-income housing. And it seems to me that the hills would be the place where the high-income housing would be placed. So I would hate for property that could be used for high-income housing to be taken out of the pool, if you will, by this being presented to a vote. Now, if there's no other good use for the property, then this would be appropriate to be submitted to the electorate. And I guess I'm not familiar enough, so these are the questions with the zone, with the boundaries, if you will, of where this property is located, what the good use for the property that's going to be subject to the election, where that is. So that's why I'm raising this issue at this time.
Very good points. One of the things that this community has long used this area for, as you know and I know, is frankly de facto recreation area. And one of the things that I'm hoping is that by getting this area firmly set aside, it will provide the impetus for developing a strong recreational type of community. Business comes in here. You probably know that the Lopers by themselves bring in hundreds of people a week. And a lot of those people shop here. This is considered by people, including a lot of people in business and professions and students and others, as some of the premier mountain bike country in this part of the world. People come from all over. If you go on YouTube, you will see a number of movies made about our hills up here. I didn't know it until I was researching it for this presentation. I had done a lot of research, but I hadn't gotten into that phase like some other people do, but I became aware of it. And I think that it will be a great impetus economically for the town in the long run to put this land to this type of use, because frankly, recreation is something we need. We have a large student community. We all know that. They need a place to go that's close at hand. They don't have to spend a lot of fuel to get there. And there's something else, as you and I know, and probably some other people know, we have 3 major earthquake faults that happen to create these hills. Geology is not only a hobby I took classes in years ago, but I've done some reading on these hills. And the Banning Fault, the San Jacinto Fault, and the Loma Linda Fault, plus 4 or 5 other unnamed faults, all happen to meet here. And that is why there are so many landslides. You know, from your work, you probably are aware, there's a lot of places they have marked landslide areas in the hills. The geologic hazards, the fire protection issues, things like that are significant in these hills. However, they're great for recreation because the soft earth like that, people just haven't gotten hurt as much, you know, when they're doing the mountain biking. So in my mind, it is putting it to one of the highest and best uses. I talked to Willard Stewart years ago. He told me there was once a very, very low-grade coal mine that some of the pioneers got a little bit of, I think, lignite coal at the bottom of Scott Canyon. And I tried to figure out with him where it had been. He'd crawled a few feet in it when he was a kid. But that was a very low-grade quality coal mine. And we joked about starting the rumor there'd been a gold mine up there, you know, and then we'd have a hills swarming with prospectors. Unfortunately for Loma Linda, or fortunately, this is not the other lode country. This does not have the Holcomb Valley type of geology. This is more of a, just like San Mateo Formation is a several thousand foot deep lake bed deposit. So basically it's kind of a loamy, silty type of dirt. And of course that is what San Tim Valley is also like, and that's why the creek always silts up. There's some things about the area here that we will always have to live with, and that's one of them. So my thought is to take the positive side of it. Your points are great, but take the positive side of it and turn this area full of fault lines and geological slides and fire hazards and have some of the greatest mountain biking country we can have. And then we ought to encourage shops that cater to recreation and things to come into our town, and frankly encourage people to go up and use it and pay their sales tax when they come here to visit. I know from talking to people like Jam and all and others who are, you know, she's now on the trail committee, she's informed me some of the people who come in from Big Bear and other places. I know of my own knowledge, I have mountain biked with people who are from Upland who come over here. And so anyway, it's a matter of opinion, but I think we are using it for about as great an economic use as you could put it to. Cost of maintenance, trails right now are maintained by Edison basically, except when people follow animal trails. So it's going to be a fairly low maintenance operation for the city, but it's going to have high value to the people of the community.
Just a final comment, Mr. Mayor and fellow council members.
Right.
I don't object to the proposed use. What I'm concerned about is whether options are taken off the table, so to speak, for the city in the event something should come up in the future. I still like the idea that I presented some time ago to City Council that maybe there could be a progressive cemetery out there, burial ground, if you will, in a natural setting. And I would hope that something like designated as open use wouldn't take that option away. So if there's a way of getting around those, considering that to be an open use in the future, if that were to come up, I think that would be ideal. My concern is that the land be used for what it is being used for, but the options not be taken off the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Always appreciate your creative thoughts.
Lloyd?
And that brings up a couple of other questions that I have, and that is what the definition of the word recreation is. Would this measure preclude, say, a swimming pool or a bowl, an outdoor bowl, or a hockey rink or a golf course? These are all recreation. Does that preclude this? What is all encompassed in the word recreation and open space? How is that defined?
I think the intent was to keep it within those types of uses that traditionally have been employed in that area. Whether recreation, I think, would include, arguably a park type setting, but open space generally doesn't involve construction of buildings or things of that nature.
So does that need to be spelled out, or how would that?
Well, I think those would be findings that could be made if and when some sort of park-type use were desired.
There's always been talk in town about what we need is some kind of an outdoor bowl, for example, for plays and that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not sure if that would come into recreation. Arts, for example, would an outdoor bowl be precluded here?
Well, I would not tend to think that an outdoor bowl with related facilities, restrooms, changing rooms, things of that nature would be within the open space and recreational type description.
And would we want to preclude that?
Well, that's for the council, I guess, to determine.
One of the areas that people have talked about for a bowl, I know a bowl's not on the agenda tonight, but if you were going to have a bowl in the community, you'd probably want to have it in an area that's accessible to the public. If you've been up, we've all been up in those, a lot of us have been up in those canyons, probably not everybody has, but when you go up Scott Canyon, you're talking about a canyon that's 50 yards wide that would not have room for cars to go up there. If we're talking about a successful bowl, it wouldn't be feasible to put it up in that type of country. That'd be some of the most difficult country to get into. Now, if somebody wanted to put a bowl down by the Holden Crooks Park area, there's access and there's room and there's parking and things like that. But I think that, at least where I was approaching it, if you look at the land that we're talking about here setting aside, this is the most rugged country we have in the city.
I would be thinking, say, more in the area of the playpen.
The playpen's not included in this.
But I mean, on public property in that area. And this area does include
The top, very top.
property up there.
Very.
I think that would be amenable to a bowl, doesn't it?
Well, I suppose one of the problems you run into is access to the playpen right now is very limited. You have private roads coming in there from the east. This can always be amended. I mean, if the public sees something, or you can always make findings, I suppose, if you have a great area. This is talking about not developing something for residential, so if something on the periphery of the area was being created, I suppose the town could have a discussion on it. But right now, the playpen itself, to even undertake a discussion on the playpen, it's all private access. So,
Yeah, but that could, I'm thinking about what we need to put in the wording here, in this measure, what we need to put in the wording to cover everything we want it to cover. What modifications can be made up there under this measure? Are we clear enough? That's what I want to know. Are we being clear enough, number one? And number two, are we, as the previous spokesperson said, are we tying our hands too severely, unintentionally? I don't know the answer. I'm just bringing it up. Now's the time to talk about that.
Well, I suppose one of the issues you run into is you have many definitions of recreation. And generally what people think of is, for areas like this, if you think of state parks and things like that, you know, they'll have a campground, and I suppose they can have a little amphitheater or something like that, and it's considered compatible. But it depends what scale you're talking about. If something that has to do with nature, I think most people would say that probably would make sense to allow that. But what this is to preclude is to have development going in of houses and frankly subdividing it. It's to keep it as open space.
What about a golf course?
Well, frankly, the problem we're talking about in this area that we're talking about here is extremely rugged. I don't think you could feasibly do a golf course. No golf course would be easy to do in this area in what we're talking about. And obviously, years ago there were discussions of golf course, and nothing's really come of them. So, you know, if you try to deal with every single possibility, I suppose you could never act on something like this, because you say there's always a chance you might want an airport, or you might want a railroad, or you might want a fairground, or, you know, you can come up with 100 ideas. And I think the goal here was to leave, the community can amend it. Recreation, I think, is the purpose for which the community would like to see it. And you know, if you were asking me and somebody wanted an amphitheater by a campground or something, I suppose I wouldn't be offended by that. But it depends where it was put. If it was on the periphery where it wasn't causing a disturbance to the trails and the hills themselves, I don't think a lot of people would probably have a big issue. But if you get into a country club with a clubhouse and all the things that have to go along with it, I don't think that that's what's being contemplated in this open space area.
Well, I mean, it would be possible, for example, that the parking in the clubhouse and everything else could be in the playpen on private property, where the golf course itself could be partly on public property, or maybe all in public. I don't know. I'm not pushing one thing or another. I'm just saying now is the time to kind of talk about, I would think, to talk about it and either preclude it or make the possibility that could happen. I don't know. I'm just...
The area that was contemplated for the golf course over in the playpen was well to the east of this. It was to the east of this. Because this is going up some pretty steep slopes. But you know, I guess a golf course may have been tentatively designed, but I never saw a final plan, and I have no idea where a clubhouse is going to go.
I'm just saying, you know, do we want to put language in here to specifically preclude it?
Well, I think in the open space area, if you're really intending it for open space, you wouldn't start. Golf courses have to redo the land.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, you know, possibly there could be some language in here that there could be no grading done or something. You could approach it from that point of view. If you didn't want a golf course or a bowl or anything else, simply say that no grading would be allowed, or no grading except for emergency access roads or trailhead roads. I don't know. I'm saying, is there some language that we need to put in here to make it more clear so we don't have to deal with this in the future and go to another referendum or whatever it is because we forgot something or it had some unintended consequences? Now's the time to talk about that.
What you think? I personally think that it's fairly simple. It talks in terms of recreation and open space, and the community can always amend it. To me, if you had a campground, in campground ancillary uses are recreation. If you go in for a golf course with a clubhouse and things, I see that as going beyond. That becomes a big commercial activity with parking lots and graded roads. But that's my opinion.
I have two people that have asked to speak, Jim Shipp and then Mike Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council. I'm Jim Shipp, live in Loma Linda, and I'm speaking as president of the Loma Linda Parks and Historical Society. We've publicly said several times at the Loma Linda Fair and at other events that we were looking as a society, and people who have talked to us have indicated support for the idea of trying to acquire about 2,000 acres of open space. And I think through all the workshops and discussions that I've been involved with, it's been pretty clear what the definition of open space is. That is, open space is not highly developed, it doesn't have grading, as you've suggested, it doesn't have a lot of permanent buildings. I think most people would understand the necessity to perhaps have some additional bathrooms if there wasn't too much actual development involved, maybe some water supplies further into the hills. But anything that involves grading and changing the topography is going to have some serious consequences with runoff and silting and erosion and flooding. And I think what I've heard over and over again is people saying, we'd really like to keep the hills just about exactly as they are now, with maybe some improvements to make them easier to hike into or bike into or ride horses into, just to improve the access and to have good maps and good trail signs. But I think that's all fairly well implied when you're talking about open space, and especially defined as open space for recreational purposes. So I'd hate for us to get too complicated in this, just because then we run the risk of voters saying, why is this so complicated? I thought we understood what this was about, and then they begin to question, well, what's the exact purpose of this? I think, as it's been described, it's very straightforward and very simple, and I think most people who are interested in the hills will get behind it and understand it, and I don't think you'll have a lot of conflicts down the road because it is under city control. You won't have developers vying for the right to develop it because it will no longer be private property and it won't be on the market. And I think those two things, the fact that it is in city hands and the fact that there will, we hope, will be a passed initiative that will protect it with the most force possible, could be about the best protection that we can give to keep the hills about the way they are now, with maybe some slight improvements to access. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike Christensen, and then Jim Walling.
Mr. Mayor, City Council, it's been my experience that when legislation comes through, the less said, the better. And I understand that you want to have a concern for unintended consequences and things in the future, but when I read words that are so simple as, and in slight variation, Mr. Shipp, this is not in the hands of the city, it's in the hands of the city citizens. Such permanent open space designation shall not be changed except upon a vote of the citizens. Said open space shall not be used for residential development or purposes of trade or acquire other properties within the South Hills area or to provide density transfers. Open space shall be open to the public recreation consistent with prior historic uses and protection of environmental values. Wordage that is, verbiage like that is so simple that anyone could understand the intent, the purpose, and what is trying to be accomplished here. This is good legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jim Walling, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. I would point you back in this discussion to the recommendation of the Trails Development Committee after many hours of study and recommendation to you that the hills be left as they are, open space with existing trails. We recognize that we lack the divine intuition and crystal ball or vision into the future to make any further recommendation than that. And just as probably the founding fathers of this country in drafting the Constitution realized that they couldn't foresee every eventuality that would arise, they made provision for constitutional amendments. And in this case, this initiative has been very clearly and very straightforwardly drafted by legal counsel. I think certainly he's covered all the legal points, but he's made it in such clear language that even the average person without legal training can understand the meaning of it. It would place the power in the hands of the people. And if they decide to put this in a preserve November 4th, then somewhere down the road, if some circumstances arose that are so compelling that the people of the city want a golf course or a bowl or a swimming pool or anything else that's going to be beyond the scope of this initiative, then it's their prerogative to put another initiative on the ballot and change it at that point. But I would urge you to consider that and carry out the recommendation of the Trails Committee and vote to put this on the ballot November 4th. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to make a comment?
Well, in light of Mr. Peterson's comments, if you wish to broaden the language just a little bit, you could add the word "and parks" after recreational use, and you could add that in the second bullet point where roads are prohibited. You could indicate except as necessary for access to trailhead locations and parks. So you could add that sort of language. I don't think it's really necessary if the focus is undeveloped open space. But if you wanted to retain a little more flexibility for, say, picnic tables and restrooms and things that are more park-like, you could do that.
One of the things that I'd point out is that you have Holder-Crooks Park, which is a very large park at the edge of this. And that's the big municipal park on the edge of it. If the area to the east of it or to the west of it were to develop, they can have, those areas can also have city parks. This isn't like this is the only area the city could ever have. And frankly, if there's any developments that go in those areas, there would probably have to be provision for parks. The area we've acquired here is among the most rugged acreage in this region. And the concern is that if you start saying, okay, let's open it up and we'll start cutting roads and things into it, that's exactly the effort we're trying to avoid. And you know, you really don't want that to start happening. A swimming pool in the middle of Scott Canyon is about the worst place you could put a swimming pool, because every flash flood it'll fill up. And that's the whole point. It's on the Loma Linda Fault. That's why there's a canyon there. The Jedi happens to be parallel to the San Jacinto Fault. It's probably sitting on top of a 7.5 earthquake down the line. And the Banning Fault, which is a branch of the San Andreas, happens to connect those two and runs right smack across the middle of the hills. And in one geology book I have from the County Museum some years ago, it said these are rather rapidly being uplifted, geologically speaking. And that's why even though they're eroding fast, they're building up even faster. I think the best thing we can do is if we want facilities, like pools or things around the hills, I think it's great. But Holder-Crooks Park is a prime example of a good area that is a fine park area. It's the beginning of the hills, but it's not in the hills. But if you go up in there, you're talking about some fairly vertical canyon walls. To do anything with that means you have to wreck it, and that is what the community is concerned about. So why open the door to doing something other than just having it be open space? If we really want to have a park on the east or on the west, this is limited in scope. The Trail Committee targeted open space doesn't take in everything from Ritchie Canyon Road to San Tim Canyon Road. It takes in the most rugged middle part. So that's the reason. I think you don't really want to start broadening it too much.
Lloyd?
Well, I'm not trying to broaden it. I just want to understand what it says so that we don't have to go through the interpretation every time we sit at a council desk. I'm not trying to broaden anything.
Okay.
That's not my purpose. So there is a sentence in here, I think, that does solve a problem, and that is on page 2 in the last part of the first paragraph. It said, open space land shall be open to public recreational use consistent with prior historic uses. And prior historic uses are mountain biking and hiking and open trails. And
sure.
Anything, it could be interpreted as anything done on that land which is not consistent with prior historic uses, like a golf course or a swimming pool, really would be not consistent with prior historic uses.
You know, so far our city has not seen fit to put a swimming pool in any park that I can think of. But I'm
things
taking.
will happen 50 years from now that we have no concept of, and there'll be, I don't know what people will be doing.
Well, if people are still swimming in 50 years, which I assume they will be, I can imagine a lot of great places for a municipal pool. And I can see it being down an area where we have a large park, where there's lots of parking, and you have a lock. I know what you're saying. I'm responding very
But
specifically.
one other question that I would have then, since we talked about Huldercook's Park, if you go way to the east, over toward the pipe, and again, where there's a lot of private land, which potentially could at some point be developed,
Sure.
because it's private land, would we allow on any piece of this property, or even on the very edge of it, where there may be some small flat areas, an equivalent of a Huldercook's Park? Would that be allowed on here?
If you go over to the very east of this, it's actually a fairly steep slope, and very, very steep. It drops off after you leave basically this land. I've hiked it quite a few times, and it's very steep.
Well, Huldercook's Park is very steep too.
Not as much as this.
I mean, it's got,
Yeah.
I mean,
I think that if you're talking about 5 feet, it seems like, why don't we just acquire the park area next to this and have it be a nice trailhead? I think that personally, I would just prefer to leave the language like it is, because it's been defined, and not try to find a way to make it more complicated. Because right now, I think the historic uses for this area are the uses that people have wanted it for. That's the reason there's some support in the town to acquire it. And if we really need a Huldercook's Park over in the east area, we can start it right where this ends and acquire some additional space for it.
Okay. Let's find out what we're going to do here. Is there a motion?
I'll make the motion to, and I'm looking for some guidance from the city attorney as to what the first motion, or do we need to do just one motion, or do we need to do 3?
Well, in this case, the building requirement is the same for all 3.
I'll make that motion then to adopt the recommendation and the wording as you have drafted it in one motion, and to put it on the ballot under those terms.
Is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion?
I was intending all 3.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. Was it aye for you?
I heard him say aye.
I didn't hear that. Okay, motion passes unanimously. We do have a closed session, but before we come to that, why don't we see if there's any reports from council members or officers? Floyd.
Just one brief comment. In respect of all of the Canadians living in the city today, I wish them a happy Canada Day. July 1 is Canada Day, is equivalent to our July 4th. That includes my wife. So, and we do have a lot of Canadians living in our community.
Okay. Anything else? Do you anticipate a report after closed session, Mr. City Attorney?
A very brief one. Just
Okay. In that case, thank you.
I have one thing. I just thought of it. I received a notice that a delegation from the university will be traveling to our sister city in India, Manipal, and they were wondering if they could have some kind of official papers or keys of the city or something to present to renew our relationship with them. I was just Everett Loma, and I don't know what his delegation is completely, but I was just wondering if we could prepare such papers or some kind of greetings.
Okay, can you put that together?
We don't need to do more action than just spirit of the council.
No, we can take care of it. One final note, I would caution the council and members of the public to be careful when crossing the Mountain View Bridge. The speed limit is 25 miles an hour, and the police are very vigorously enforcing that.
I saw some revenue being raised this morning along there.
And does it count as a construction zone when there's no construction going on yet? Because it doubles the fines.
It is. There was construction today.
Okay.
It was happening today. They were out there.
Okay, why don't we put up cameras?
Are you making that as a motion?
not on the agenda.
Okay, thank you.